Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're stepping into a really fascinating, maybe slightly murky period of Irish history. We're looking at a specific short-lived counterinsurgency police unit, the Criminal Investigation Department, or CID.
Yeah, and for this deep dive, we've got some material that details, its establishment right after the truce with Britain, which of course ended the War of Independence, and then its activities during the really intense Irish Civil War that followed, and finally how it was wound down.
Exactly. So our goal here is to really try and understand why the CID was created in the first place. What kind of methods did it actually use? And, what lasting impact, if any, did it have on policing in Ireland? Okay, so let's unpack this. Where did this rather unique unit come from?
Well, the CID's emergence was almost immediate. It followed the truce in July 1921, and it was conceived, really brought into being by Michael Collins, a huge figure in Ireland's fight for independence. That direct link to someone like Collins, right at the top of the emerging Irish state, tells you something important from the get-go about its purpose and authority.
And it wasn't like a standard police force, was it? The sources make it pretty clear that a lot of its members actually came from the Irish Republican Army, the IRA.
That's a really critical point. Many CID personnel were, former IRA fighters, men who'd served under Collins during the War of Independence. Some were even drawn from the Squad, Collins' Dublin-based assassination unit.
Sure.
So that background gives you a sense of the kind of experience and maybe the operational mindset that some key members brought to this new group.
Right, so definitely not your average police constables walking the beat. It sounds like they had some pretty significant connections, too. The material mentions close ties to Army intelligence and something called the Protective Corps, all based at Oriel House in Dublin.
Yeah, Oriel House. It quickly became the central hub for these intertwined intelligence and security efforts. Initially, Liam Tobin, another veteran, was in command of the CID, but later, in July 1922, control sort of shifted to civilian oversight under Joseph McGrath. He was a Teach Adala, member of the Irish Parliament. Then Captain Pat Moynihan took over as commanding officer. He was actually temporarily moved from his job as head of military intelligence.
Okay. So that shift, it reflects the sort of tricky process of setting up civilian authority over security, right? Especially in wartime.
Exactly. It was a very delicate balancing act.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting for me. The official setup of the CID seems to coincide with a really pivotal and tragic moment.
It does. The CID was officially formed on August 22nd, 1922. That was the exact day Michael Collins was killed in an ambush. It's a stark coincidence, isn't it? Really underlines the volatile, dangerous context this unit was born into. Its official mandate was to operate distinctly from the existing police forces. It had its own headquarters, reporting directly to the Minister for Home Affairs. Makes you wonder if the timing was just coincidence, or if Collins' death maybe solidified the need for this kind of specialized unit.
Yeah, it certainly highlights how precarious things were for the new state.
Yeah, definitely.
And it was a pretty unique kind of force, wasn't it? I mean, heavily armed, operating in plain clothes. It almost sounds like a paramilitary unit inside a policing framework.
That's a fair way to put it, I think.
Yeah.
It was formed from people who'd served in both the National Army and the Irish Republican Police, based out of Oriel House, Started with over 100 heavily armed men. And interestingly, 3 women detectives, too. They worked undercover, disguised as typists, apparently, focusing on female anti-government activity.
Oh, wow.
By February 1923, their numbers had grown quite a bit, to a peak of about 350. This structure, it really highlights the immediate need they felt for a strong, covert force to tackle the anti-treaty IRA during the Civil War. Those who opposed the Anglo-Irish Treaty, of course.
We've mentioned a few key names: Collins, Tobin, McGrath, Moynihan. Who else was really influential in shaping the CID?
Well, beyond those, Peter Ennis is a significant figure. He was appointed chief superintendent. He'd previously been the commanding officer of the Irish Republican Police in Dublin during the War of Independence. And he brought about 15 experienced men with him from his old command. They formed a sort of core element within the CID.
Okay.
It's also worth noting the early involvement of guys like Broy, Nelligan, and McNamara. They were from the Dublin Metropolitan Police's G branch, the intelligence specialist, though they eventually moved over to the National Army Intelligence Department.
So that highlights the kind of ad hoc and interconnected nature of intelligence gathering back then, people moving between different groups.
Yeah, absolutely. Things are still very much in flux as the Civil War developed. Different bodies were being set up. Personnel shifted around based on need.
So it clearly wasn't just about gathering information. The sources strongly suggest they were, actively involved in suppressing the anti-treaty side. We have a picture of who these people were. Let's turn now to what the CID actually did. What were their operations like during the Civil War?
Right. Well, during the Civil War, the CID is credited with arresting over 500 anti-treaty IRA fighters, and they seized a significant amount of weaponry, plus important documents. They also built up files on more than 2,500 Republican suspects. So there was a substantial intelligence gathering operation running alongside the more direct actions.
But as you hinted, the sources also point to a much darker side, accusations of, well, harsh interrogation methods and even assassinations.
This is where the history gets really controversial and, frankly, quite grim. The sources detail several specific incidents. There's the killing of 5 Republicans in late August 1922, 2 separate events. Their bodies were found in Drumcondra and Clondalkin, areas of Dublin, and British intelligence reports from around that time noted their belief that the CID had, quote, killed a number of prominent Republicans in Dublin.
And it wasn't just those incidents, was it? The sources mention others, like Bobby Bonfield and Noel Lamass, other anti-treaty activists killed by plainclothed men in Dublin. Suspicion often fell on the CID for those two. And the case of Thomas Derrick shot in the eye while in CID custody, that's particularly disturbing.
It is a deeply troubling aspect of this whole period. Now, the sources do acknowledge it's possible other groups, or maybe individuals acting alone, could have been responsible for some deaths. But the popular perception at the time, and often the historical narrative, points towards Oriel House, the CID headquarters.
Right.
Brian O'Higgin's work, Salute to the Men of 22, documents at least 25 murders of Republicans just in Dublin. It gives you a sense of the scale. And it's important to remember the wider context, too. The Civil War was brutal. There are reports suggesting up to 153 Republican prisoners might have been summarily executed in the field during the conflict overall.
So, given all this,
Mhm.
what does it tell us about how effective the CID actually was? Was it sophisticated intelligence work or something else that made them, well, successful in the short term?
It seems, based on one study mentioned in the sources, that Oriel House succeeded in its task of suppressing small-scale Republican activities in the Dublin area. But crucially, by the more direct method of striking terror into its opponents, rather than through, say, sophisticated intelligence gathering and analysis.
Striking terror. So, relying on fear.
Yeah. That approach, relying on fear, it raises serious questions, doesn't it, about long-term stability and the potential for abuse, which, as we see with the brutality accusations, seems to have unfortunately happened.
It paints a very grim picture of those times. And despite their controversial methods, they weren't immune to danger themselves. The sources mentioned 4 CID personnel were killed during the war.
That's right, 4 killed. And there were multiple attempts to bomb Oriel House itself. It's a stark reminder, really, of just how intense and violent things were. It wasn't a one-sided conflict. The risks were huge for everyone involved, no matter which side they were on.
Given those methods and the fact the Civil War eventually ended, it's maybe not surprising the CID wasn't seen as a permanent fixture in Irish policing.
Precisely. It was disbanded on October 29, 1923, relatively quickly after the Civil War concluded. It was basically deemed unsuitable for peacetime policing in its current form. But its existence wasn't without some lasting consequences.
How so? What happened to the people who served in the CID after it was dissolved?
Well, interestingly, about 30 members were transferred over to the Dublin Metropolitan Police, the DMP, specifically to work as detectives. And this group essentially formed the basis of what became the Garda Special Branch, which later evolved into the Garda Special Detective Unit, the SDU, as it's known today.
Oh, okay, so a direct lineage there.
It suggests that, a continuation of some of the skills and perhaps even some of the operational mindset of the CID within the later, more established police structures. The DMP itself was then amalgamated with the Garda Síochána in 1925, further integrating that element.
So while direct evidence might be scarce, you could speculate that the experience, maybe some of the more assertive tactics from former CID members, could have influenced the early special branch, especially how they handled intelligence and subversive activities.
It's certainly a reasonable speculation, given that direct transfer of personnel into that detective role.
Okay, so let's try and summarize then. We've looked into the rapid setup of the CID right after the truce, an organization made up largely of former IRA fighters. We've examined their operations during that really brutal Irish Civil War. noting both their success in suppressing anti-treaty activities, but also the deeply contentious methods they used, which led to serious allegations, brutality, extrajudicial killings.
And it's crucial to remember this was an armed, plainclothes force operating outside the normal policing structures during an exceptionally turbulent, violent time in Irish history.
Right. And finally, despite its fairly short life, the transfer of some of its people into the Dublin Metropolitan Police and then into what became the Garda Special Branch, that suggests the CID did have a tangible, longer-term impact on how Irish policing evolved, particularly in those specialized areas like intelligence and security ops.
Which leads us to a final, perhaps challenging question for you, the listener, to think about. Reflecting on the CID's methods, its effectiveness through fear, and its short operational life. What does this whole episode reveal about the immense difficulties? And maybe the moral compromises involved when trying to establish security and order right after a deeply divisive and bloody internal conflict.
A very profound point to end on. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today.